This is the introduction video for radical functions and equations. The learning outcomes are to review solving rational, absolute value, and quadratic equations, solve radical equations with one or two radical signs, and to solve quadratic-like equations that contain rational exponents. To begin, we want to make sure that we know how to solve rational equations, and the big thing about that is that we need to know how to determine domain restrictions. We're going to do the same thing when we talk about radical equations. Remind ourselves that y is equal to the square root of x is our parent function, and the graph of that of our parent function looks something like this, which had a domain that said that it could include 0 and go all the way to infinity. So notice we cannot have a negative number inside the radical, because we learned that if we were going to get the square root of a -4, we're going to get like 2i, which is imaginary and not on my graph. The other thing we need to do is remind ourselves of how to do absolute value. The big thing there is that we had to isolate the absolute value function when we were solving. The same thing's going to happen when we're having our radical. So we might have something that says x plus 2 here, and then maybe a -5 is equal to 0. Then the first thing we're going to have to do is to move this -5 to the other side. And then now that we've isolated the radical on this side, then we can use our techniques in order to get rid of it. In this case, since this is a square root function, then we would square both sides, and we would get x plus 2 is equal to 25. And then we can see that our value for x, and then we can check it to make sure it works. Now remember that when we have the square root of x plus 2, that's a transformation that says to make it go 2 to the left. So it actually starts here. So we can have a -1 or a -2 as an answer, but it would not be able to have -5, let's say. So that's the reason why we need to remind ourselves that our domain restrictions, or our domain for our radical functions, and because we're going to have to check that, just like we did that with the rational functions. Lastly, we need to make sure we know how to do quadratic equations, because just like we did when we did rational equations, that when we're going around solving, we might end up with a quadratic equation or a linear equation that we are going to have to solve. So that's all I want to say about making sure you know how to do or solve those types of equations.